This is Pennsylvania Inside Out on WPSU TV. Here's tonight's host, Patty Satalia.
Good evening. Coming up on Pennsylvania Inside Out, our new cathedrals. In recent years, construction of new multi-million-dollar sports facilities has grown rapidly. In North America alone, there are 120 major professional sports franchises. 90 of these teams are playing in new stadiums or are planning to construct new facilities, and in the vast majority of cases, public money, a lot of it, is paying for the projects. Penn State's Bob Trumpbour has analyzed American sports stadiums and arenas, looking specifically at the cultural attitudes that transcend sports and society. We talked with Trumpbour about his analysis and his new book, The New Cathedrals: Politics and Media in the History of Stadium Construction. You say that modern American stadiums are the new cathedrals. How does a PNC Park or even a Beaver Stadium, for that matter, compare with a St. Peter's Basilica or Notre Dame, for example, then?
You know, it doesn't. But, from an aesthetic standpoint, it's probably a pretty bad argument. But from a standpoint of what we seem to value in society, and the things that we put the highest premium on, I think you can make a good case for it. Think about how the Super Bowl is the most watched event in our society, and people spend a lot of money on that. Think about how cities, when they're struggling with other infrastructure issues, will pony up money for stadiums. So I think in that regard, you can make a case for it. And as part of a consumer culture, a commercial culture, I think you can make a very good case for us moving to the stadium as sort of the preeminent landmark for so many urban areas.
What was the inspiration for the book? What prompted this?
When I was a young kid, I remember my dad he worked for a company called Scoville Manufacturing, and I remember he was the guy who was put in charge of distributing the tickets to the sales staff. And I remember, when he had a date where no one was going to the ball game, he would bring us and we'd go to Yankee Stadium, and we had wonderful seats about 5 or 6 rows back from the announcer's booth. And I just remember just looking at the stadium, and Yankee Stadium being this historic, venerable place. And it was something from childhood that was really of interest to me.
Give us an idea, just how great is this scope of revamping, rebuilding, remodeling stadiums all across the country?
It's really very dramatic. And let me just give you an instance. And I guess this might tie in with the church analogy. But the Diocese of New York is closing 21 churches. At the same time, they're putting that metropolitan area is putting probably a bit more than $4 billion into sports infrastructure. They're replacing Yankee Stadium, they're replacing Shea Stadium. The Giants and the Jets are building a new football stadium. The Nets are building a new place. The Devils are building a new place. So you think we're closing churches and we're spending millions on a place for the Devils. So we've kind of arrived at a strange place.
So what does this say about our values and our priorities?
It probably says that we ought to step back a little and think about what we ought to be doing. Really look at the big picture. I enjoy going to ballparks as much as anyone, and I'm a sports fan, but at the same time, I think the priorities are a little warped. I know when Art Modell said the pride and presence of professional football is worth more to a city than 30 libraries, and that's an exact quote. It's got to make you scratch your head and think. From my vantage point, I'll take 30 libraries as much as I enjoy going to a Steelers game or a Pirates game or an Altoona Curve game. But a lot of people don't fit in that category.
What's interesting is that the arguments that are used to justify these enormous construction expenditures are economic development. Is that really, does it stand up in the end?
Not really. I mean, from the city standpoint, no. From the owner's standpoint, sure, they're making some good money off it. And the owners are doing very well with the stadiums. Simply put, they get sweetheart deals that allow them to get the concession revenue, allow them to get parking revenue, allow them to get naming rights revenues, allow them to get, revenues from, as an example, seat licensing agreements that they make with the fans. So there's a whole host of things that benefit the owners. But in terms of economic development, you'd probably be better served putting it into education or opportunities that make people more productive.
And yet if you talk to someone like Frank DeFord, he calls these stadiums the 20th century village green. It's a place where we come together to share in an experience. Does sport really bring us together? I mean, I'm thinking that the Super Bowl has millions of people all over the country doing the same thing at the same time,
Sure.
but are we really coming together?
You know, I think in some instances it does, but in some cases, you know, it doesn't. And I think it divides people at times, more so now than it did in the past. You know, I think when there was a commonality and people sort of rooted for the home team, there was a much greater bring people together. It's funny, but you know, I'll see Eagles jerseys when I'm walking the streets of Pittsburgh, or I'll see Steelers jerseys, you know, or Cowboys jerseys in Philadelphia, and it makes me, you know, pause and say, we've sort of splintered the sports environment, the sports marketplace, to the extent that I'm not so sure it brings us together to the degree that it once did.
Now, you in your book, you talk about the Cincinnati Reds. In 1912, they were in Crossley Field. In 1970, they were in a brand new Riverfront Stadium. Then in 2003 came the Great American Ballpark with amenities, you know, just an incredible amount of amenities, the highlight of which may be their underground parking. But explain this push. Is there one single biggest factor that's driving the push for new, bigger, better?
Do you know that essentially what's driving it is the economics from the team owner's perspective, and the fact that there are a limited number of sports franchises that are major league. So, you know, very few cities are, you know, can say they have an NFL or a Major League Baseball franchise, and there are a number of cities that say, we'd like to do that. You know, there are, you know, large cities like Las Vegas doesn't have a franchise, yet the metropolitan area has well over 1 million people. So there's always the threat to move, and that threat to move, and you think about Los Angeles not having an NFL franchise, that creates a huge vacuum that allows the threat to move to be that much more effective.
But interestingly enough, you found that in places where there are NFL franchises, rents are higher and wages are lower.
Actually, there was a study, you know, that was put together, and it's fascinating because, you know, it's hard to know whether it's sports or the fact that there's a greater degree of cultural amenities and people are willing to pay more for that. So, you know, it's hard, it's sort of a chicken and egg type of argument. But I do think that, you know, people who want to live in a major league city might say, I'll work for a little less because I like being considered major league. So there might be some cultural value to it.
Recently, the Cleveland Browns snuck out of town almost in the middle of the night. They're now in Baltimore. A number of other teams have used that as a strategy to sweeten pots, to sweeten deals. The Pittsburgh Penguins, for example, were enticed to stay in Pittsburgh because of some negotiation over a threat to leave. How should communities feel about this? Or is it a good thing to do whatever it takes to keep them, or are we putting a lot at risk?
I think you need to set limits. I really think that that politicians have to think about what, you know, where the line is. You know, I think one of the things politicians have done in recent years to really try to make sure that this doesn't become something that spins out of control and doesn't damage them, there's no blowback, is they've tried to do the referendums. You know, when you do a referendum, then it's in the voters' hands. But it's a tough one because the politicians are put in the middle of a situation. If a team does leave, they're blamed for it. If a team doesn't, you know, if a team stays but they pay millions and millions more than they should have, or than the taxpayers feel they should have, they're blamed for that too. So it becomes a tough battle. It
wasn't always the case that the burden was on taxpayers to fund these huge stadiums. Why did that change and when?
Do you know, it's a fascinating one because in my book I talk about the early days, the good old days. And back then the politicians really, you know, were part of the system that in the progressive era they called honest graft. You know, and they would basically figure out how to make deals that benefited themselves but didn't cost the taxpayers. And in some ways they probably did eventually, but they call that honest graft. And you know, they would put their thumbs down on the owners, and the owners worked with the politicians, and they were very careful about that. You know, I know in Pittsburgh when they built Forbes Field, the owner wasn't even on hand for the groundbreaking, and I think it was part of a strategy to sort of be low-key about the whole thing. It really started changing post-World War II. 1953, when the Braves moved from Boston to Milwaukee, they moved into a subsidized facility, something that the taxpayers built in Milwaukee. And that changed the dynamic. It got a lot of owners to start thinking about build a municipal stadium for us. So that was probably the turning point.
But even when communities, when voters say, I don't want this tax burden, I'm thinking of the Seattle Mariners. They had a 20-year-old stadium, the Kingdom. They wanted a new stadium. Taxpayers rejected it, and yet it was built anyway.
Yeah, and it's hard to justify that. I mean, my feeling on it is if the voters firmly vote against it, it really ought not happen. But it's happened in a number of cities. I mean, Pittsburgh among them. I mean, you know, Pittsburgh rejected the stadium referendum. And what happened was the folks decided, well, what the taxpayers want is that we use existing streams of revenue, not new taxes. So they tried to hammer out a deal that did that. Now, I'm not so sure that's exactly what the taxpayers wanted, but that's what the taxpayers got. So, you know, it's a tough one because I think the politicians, I think they're trying to do what they think the citizens want, but I think that if they really wanted to, you know, measure public opinion more carefully, they could probably get a better sense of that.
Do these new stadiums attract more bums in the seats? You know, I mean, are they getting more people because it's a newer facility?
They do for a while. There's sort of a novelty effect, so that what happens is people want to go see the new ballparks for a while. I would argue that George Steinbrenner with the Yankees is taking a tremendous risk because he's moving into something that I think for maybe a 4 or 5 year period will have a novelty effect that people will want to see this new grand ballpark. But if you think beyond, you know, that 5-year horizon, all of that history that was made in the old ballpark, you know, DiMaggio, Ruth, Gehrig, that's gone, you know, and I'm not so sure that you can recapture that and resell that in something that's not on the same ground.
Well, speaking of which, the Boston Red Sox have been at Fenway Park since 1912 and the Chicago Cubs at Wrigley Field since 1914, and it seems to have worked for them.
You know, those are the two teams. The Cubs are probably one of the most interesting examples because they seem to have losing teams year in and year out. They've had a couple exceptions, but by and large they have losing teams, yet they've packed the stands. And part of it is, if you've ever been to Wrigley, I don't even have to explain it to you. It's just a neat ballpark, and it's an experience. You know, you're not going to see the same amount of retailing space, which probably has Tribune Corporation, the parent company that owns the Cubs, disappointed. But at the same time, fans love Wrigley Field. And, you know, when I've been to Fenway, you know, the seats are a little bit more cramped, but you're closer to the action, and there's just a neat ambiance and a great feel. And you think about, I don't know, there are very few places I go to where I kind of get goosebumps when I walk in, but, you know, some of these really old ballparks, I think of Ted Williams and the days spent there and all the players that were there during those years. And I kind of get goosebumps when I go in those places.
You know, a lot of these stadiums were built with the Roman model in mind of the sports experience. And class issues certainly are a part of this. There's regular seating, and then there's sky boxes, and there was something similar to that in Roman days where you didn't have to pass someone from a different class.
Sure, and it seems like the ballparks have gotten more sort of segregated along those lines. Now, an absolute fanatic, someone who might make, you know, $30,000 or $40,000 a year, who's willing to sink, you know, 10% of their revenue into, you know, their season tickets in a prime location might be the exception. But I think by and large, we've gotten segregation along economic lines.
So the rich folks are sitting in the good seats and everyone else is sort of sitting in general admission.
By and large, with a few exceptions.
Now, sports stadiums in colleges, at colleges and universities seem to be a whole different ballgame, no pun intended, much different from NFL franchise in terms of what they spend and who they attract. I mean, Beaver Stadium, for example, has been caught up in this whole upgrade and renovation. They're the second largest in the nation for the kind of facility that it is, seating 107,000 plus. Talk about the difference between a college stadium and an NFL franchise.
Yeah, I actually make the analogy in the book so that people can understand the economics of stadium construction. And if you think about it, I mean, Penn State has one of the finest business programs in the country. I don't think they would make a ridiculous economic decision if it was more economically feasible for them to make much more revenue building a brand new stadium, they probably would have done it. But instead, they put money into renovation, and they put less than $100 million into renovation, which wouldn't get you very much at all on the professional level. You know, that's less than a third of anything that's being produced now. Essentially, when you look at the college game, you also have another difference. You're bringing in a lot of revenue from outside the region, whereas by and large, there might be some money from outside the region in a professional football environment or a professional baseball environment. But for the most part, the revenue comes from within that metropolitan area. So, you know, as far as the economics, it's economically beneficial to a region when you bring in visitors. Now, if you have a hot team and a very attractive stadium, it's harder to get tickets to that area, so you're not going to come in. So what happens is, you know, I think of Chicago when Jordan was playing for the Bulls. The United Center probably did less to help the Chicago economy because you had to be from around Chicago to get a ticket to that game. So it was cycling it within the economy. And if you think about it in those terms, you'll probably start to make wiser decisions about what to do with your money.
Talk a little bit about the Astrodome, which was built back in 1965 and was state-of-the-art and innovative in so many ways when it came on board.
Sure, the Astrodome is a fascinating facility. You know, in fact, one of my faculty colleagues, Ken Womack's dad, helped in engineering the Astrodome, but it had so many things. It was probably the first place that was built to be sort of, at least in the United States, to sort of be a spectacle and a place unto itself. I mean, it had the bowling alley and it had a barber shop, it had a presidential suite, it had just so many different things that were never part of a stadium before. In some ways, it motivated some of the wild amenities that you get today.
The Louisiana Superdome, which was built in 1976, because that could actually, the Astrodome could actually fit inside of it. And when it was built, it was believed that it would be such a boon to Louisiana. Was it? Did it turn out to be the case?
You know, it's done some good things for Louisiana, but by and large, you know, I think you know, Louisiana was lucky in that it had sort of that jazz culture and it had a lot of entertainment that allowed it to attract Super Bowls. You know, the Superdome may have been one of those ones where they probably did a little bit better than most cities because they could become a place for Super Bowls, a place for major events, you know, and they can also book a lot of concerts and things, you know, so that, you know, kind of like a typical arena where you can book a lot of other things. They were able to get some things that they couldn't otherwise get. You know, when I went to the Superdome, I did ask them some questions about, you know, whether they would want professional baseball in there, because they certainly could do that and reconfigure it. And they said, no, we have enough events that we bring in and out of here, and we think that, you know, we probably do just as well with the concerts and some of the other things that we bring in.
Are multi-purpose stadiums, based on your research, a good idea, a good way to go?
You know, it seems like stadium building generally is not a good idea for the taxpayers, and I think of the Edward Jones Dome in St. Louis, it really didn't bring much money. And there's a guy, Haywood Sanders, who's an expert on convention centers and those kinds of things, and he talks about the economics of convention centers and how that's also sort of a negative drain on the local economy, and how, you know, they sort of become black holes for the maintenance that goes into them. And what happens is you build a dome, they sort of become an adjunct to a conference center. So what winds up happening is they become a place where you can attract people to your city to some degree, but they're for short conventions, and it's hard to book good big conventions anymore. And you think about, you know, the communication strategies now. You know, people are getting better at you know, putting on convention type things without even going to places.
Interesting, a lot of things going on. What role did the media play in this huge push to upgrade?
Do you know, media coverage tends to look at the people who are trying to get the stadiums built and tends to not give as much coverage to the folks who might be on the margins or on the sidelines. And that's happened since the beginning, even when the owners were paying for the ballparks and stadiums. So what's tough is there's been this general tendency, and I think it's sort of a media tendency to frame the issue, you know, along the lines of who's trying to do something. And if you're trying to do something, that gets more positive coverage.
Now, this book it was exhaustively researched. There are 12 pages of resources. Is this helping to inform the debate? It seems to me like it should be required reading for government officials, or at least for the public, so they're informed about these issues.
I hope so. I know yesterday they had some congressional hearings, and they were in a subcommittee, and I just know that they were looking at urban infrastructure and those issues. And my hope is that they looked at the book and they looked at some of the chapters, and that maybe they got some enlightenment from that, but it's hard to say.
All right. Well, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you
really
very much. It was a pleasure.
Our guest has been Bob Trumpbour. His book is The New Cathedrals, which was published by Syracuse Press. If you'd like more information on this or other stories that have appeared on this program, please go to our website. It's wpsu.org/Inside Out. That's going to wrap things up for this edition of Pennsylvania Inside Out. For all of us here at WPSU, have a good night.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.